where we are having the first conference on renewable energy and employment, and we are presenting our report on renewable energy jobs that we have conducted during 2013. I think that the conference of today and the report reflects really the evolution of IRENA. 2 years ago, during the assembly, we were presenting our first policy brief. It was a 10-page document. The year after, we were presenting the first report on jobs and access. It was like 40 pages report. And today we are presenting a comprehensive report for the full renewable energy sector together with this conference. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate my colleagues in the policy unit for this very hard work. We have structured the conference following the chapters of the report. So we will have the first session on global trends. We will have a session on policies, a third session on education, a fourth session of the social aspect, gender and actors, and finally, benefiting from the fact that we are here in the UAE, in the Gulf, we have added a session on employment in the Gulf region. Before we start also, I would like to mention that this is only part of the work that IRENA is doing in socioeconomics. We have this platform called IREValue with many other activities like the economic value mentioned by Mr. Shak, are putting together all the knowledge, all the people to work together and to look forward not only to assess the employment effect, but other macroeconomic effects of energy security, GDP, trade balance, and so on. And before I kindly ask the panelists for the first session to join me, I would like to mention there is a small change in the agenda. Unfortunately, because of the bad weather condition in the US, Mr. Adil Najam cannot be here with us today. And Ms. Ulrike Lehr has kindly accepted to be the moderator for the first session. So please kindly join me here in the podium. Ulrike, Mr. Michael Renner, Arturos, please, Marlene, and Mr. Esterace, and myself.
Everybody found his or her seat? Yes. Well, thank you, Hugo, for the kind introduction. And I think, without further ado, I just go to our first presentation on this panel. And I would like to introduce Michael Renner, who I have known for, I think, the last 2 years. We worked on parts of the report together. And Michael is a senior researcher at the World Watch Institute. I'm sorry that I'm having to read this, partly because I'm just filling in for somebody. But he's, I'd say an old hand in the business. So all the way back to 1991, he already worked on a World Watch paper, Jobs in a Sustainable Economy, and he contributed to UNEP's Green Jobs report towards decent work in a sustainable low-carbon world. And I think, as I said, without further ado, I kindly ask Michael to just go to take your presentation and take the floor. Thank you.
I'm really excited and honored to be here. I think this is quite a great moment to celebrate the recognition that renewable energy jobs are coming into their own, have come into their own. In a world that's still recovering from financial and economic crisis and which is still saddled by rather high unemployment in many parts of the world, the potential for fervor for additional job creation is, of course, a very attractive proposition. Governments, the private sector, civil society, I think everybody is recognizing increasingly that meeting the challenge of a greener and cleaner energy economy is impossible without the active involvement of millions of skilled and also motivated individuals, whether they work in small or large enterprises, in the private sector or in the public sector. As has been already mentioned before, this report shows that renewable energy has become a very significant employer. The available information, and clearly to some extent this is estimates rather than very firm numbers, the available information suggests that some 5.7 million people worldwide are now employed in the sector, either directly or indirectly in the supply chain. Good. The bulk of the employment, as the Director General just mentioned, is concentrated in a relatively small number of countries, but also very important countries in China, in the members of the European Union, the United States, Brazil, and India. And these are, of course, at this point still the main manufacturers of renewable energy equipment. They are very important producers of bioenergy feedstocks, and they are the leaders in installed production capacity. But I think it's really important to note that a large number of additional countries are now also increasing their investments, are increasing their capacities, and are beginning to see the fruits in terms of employment of these processes, of these decisions, of these investments. So as you can see in this first slide, the largest number of jobs at this point are found both in the biofuels sector and in solar photovoltaics, with about 1.4 million jobs each. In comparison, the solar heating and cooling, wind power, and biomass sectors are somewhat smaller, but still each employ several 100,000 people. And that's, of course, a pretty significant number. For the time being, the remaining renewable energy technologies employ somewhat smaller numbers of people, but I think we will see in coming years that they too will increase in significance. Now, let's look at some of the trends and dynamics that we can, where we have fairly good information. Over the past decade, the wind power related employment has expanded more than sevenfold. This slide shows basically a number of recent estimates, and put together gives you a bit of a sense of how things have played out over time. As exciting as the development in the wind sector has been, in solar PV, it's in recent years been even more exciting. There has been a very rapid development, and the numbers of jobs have accordingly increased quite fast. We don't quite have the same sense of how things have developed over the years, but we know that in solar heating and cooling, the employment worldwide has at least tripled since 2005, perhaps even more than that. For some of the other renewable energy technologies, I think we can pretty much be sure that the numbers of jobs are going up as well. We just don't have quite as much of the same detail as for wind and solar PV. For a number of countries, we have very good information in terms of how things have developed in recent years. I want to talk very briefly about the experiences of Germany, Spain, and the United States. Germany, as has been mentioned before, has developed one of the largest renewable energy industries in the world, due mainly to very strong and consistent supportive policies. So employment in renewable energy has more than doubled from about 160,000 jobs in 2004 to about 380,000 jobs in 2012. Wind and solar, again, have played very major roles in this regard. We see in comparison, so there's quite a steady development. We see in comparison in Spain, we also had at least for a number of years very rapid growth, from as low as 3,500 jobs in 1998 to more than 130,000 in 2008. But since then, economic crisis and a change in the governmental support policies have made for quite a change, and you can see this in this slide. There has been the loss of several tens of thousands of jobs in the last few years. In the United States, it's a bit of a different story. Overall, there is growth in employment, but we see more in the way of fluctuation than we see certainly in Germany. That's due in part to what's going on in the wind sector, but also in bioethanol. And again, this relates to changes in governmental policies from year to year. What is exciting, however, is the situation in solar photovoltaics, where the overall number of jobs has increased very, very strongly, particularly in installations. Now, when we compare the situation in these three countries and some others with the rest of the world, it's quite clear that for many countries, the available data are still not all that robust, certainly not very complete or up to date. So there's a lot of work still to do to fill in data gaps and data uncertainties. This is also not just a matter of numbers, of course. We need to look at the quality of the information available. One item I think that's very important is to say that the methodologies that are being used in the different studies that are available diverge quite substantially. So methodology is something that we need to pay more attention to, and I hope you all have time to be here for the session around lunchtime when Ulrike and her colleagues will talk about that very important aspect. There are a number of data gaps, as I say. If you look, for example, at India, the government has provided information across the range of renewable energy technologies, but only for a single year. So I think we need a better sense how things are developing over time. In Brazil, it's sort of a little bit the opposite problem. We have very good time series data for the bioenergy, biofuel sector, but we have far less information about other renewable energy technologies. There is certainly, as we move forward, a need to improve the availability of information, the quality of information with regard to the many different kinds of occupations and skills that are found in the renewable energy industry. From anything from agriculture to manufacturing, construction, and various services. It will be important to generate more in the way of disaggregated information about these various aspects. And I think we also need to look far more than has been the case so far at the quality of jobs, at things like wages, work conditions. I also want to highlight one of the chapters in this report which concerns itself with the issue of gender, which we found is really an issue that's very important, and yet we have still very limited information. So there's much work to be done in this regard. Let me talk briefly about some of the challenges. Even as overall employment continues to grow, there is without doubt growing turbulence in the renewable energy industry. Let me just talk about a few factors here. I mean, many of these I'm sure will not come to you as something that you have not heard about before. One is the regional shifts, the ongoing regional shifts that are ongoing, particularly in the manufacturing of renewable energy equipment and specifically in wind and solar. This, of course, has also led to shifting patterns of employment around the world. By contrast, the employment in installations and in operations and maintenance is far more localized, so there is far less in the way of shifts. Another item I think that's worth mentioning is what's happening with regard to investment trends. During 2012, the total installed renewable energy capacity grew by more than 8%, but global investments dropped by nearly 12%. And just recently released information indicates that 2013, again, investments have dropped. Now, what's happening here, I think, is the product of somewhat contradictory trends. On one hand, we have lower costs, particularly in the solar sector, and so it is just simply cheaper to install more capacity. But I think it's also quite clear that the remaining uncertainties in terms of governmental support policies and so on play a role in this as well. And so I think we have to be very careful in terms of how this will play out in the future. A related factor is overcapacities. We see that in the PV sector, solar PV, in wind, but also in biofuels, biomass to some extent. If you look specifically at solar PV, where this has been quite pronounced, we see, again, a somewhat contradictory outcome in terms of what this means for employment. On the one hand, lower panel prices have triggered a boom in installations and, of course, therefore a boom in the employment that goes with it. And that's a wonderful thing. On the other hand, of course, it's quite clear that manufacturers in many countries have struggled. We have seen the loss of jobs. Another factor I want to mention is the impact of economic crisis, of austerity in some countries, and also, as I mentioned earlier, policy uncertainties. In countries like Spain and elsewhere in Southern Europe in particular, the impact of the economic crisis has been such that government's ability and I guess to some extent enthusiasm for supporting renewable energy expansion has been dampened to some extent. In the United States, for example, you have this rather strange picture of the Congress having to renew the wind energy production tax credits on a regular basis. And whenever there is a delay or whenever there's uncertainty whether this tax credit will be renewed, we see sort of a temporary fluctuation in the wind energy sector, and that has impact on employment as well. So briefly, in terms of what does the future hold, we have a number of studies that are trying to project forward what the numbers might be in terms of employment across the renewable energy sector, and the Director General of IRENA has mentioned that already. I think one factor that is worth mentioning here is, other than how investments and how installed capacity figures will develop, we need to look at labor productivity. Of course, over time, economies of scale, automation, doing by learning effects will have the impact that fewer people per unit of capacity are needed than otherwise might be the case. If you look, for example, at the Energy Revolution 2012 report, it foresees that renewable energy employment worldwide could grow by 2/3 by the year 2020, but then the authors of the report assumed that between 2020 and 2030, there may be a dip of about 8% in employment due to increased labor productivity. To some extent, on one hand, increased labor productivity can be seen as a bit of a problem because the numbers involved are less than they otherwise would be. But there are also qualitative aspects, and let me just briefly mention, in Brazil, what we already see ongoing is that the mechanization of biofuels harvesting is reducing labor needs. So manual jobs, very, very tough jobs, are being replaced by fewer but higher skilled and higher quality, better quality jobs. So this, in a sense, is a positive development as long as we can make sure that those people who lose their jobs, who get displaced, get the retraining they need, get some other assistance that they require. So let me come to a conclusion here. Clearly, improved and sufficiently fine-grained information on employment, both on the quantitative and qualitative sides, is quite important in helping governments understand the effectiveness of their policies, understand what kinds of adjustments may be needed, for example, in the labor market specifically. So to the extent that high-quality, detailed information can be made available, distinguishing between direct and indirect employment, I think this will be very good. Disaggregating among the different segments of the industry, anything from agriculture to construction, manufacturing services, providing better occupational and job quality details, and differentiating as much as possible between domestic and export-driven employment. So governments may wish to consider, among others, the following steps to improve our understanding of the employment benefits of renewable energy. One, support detailed and regular macroeconomic studies, as Germany is doing. Conduct more systematic industry surveys, as is being done in some of the industries in some countries around the world. But I think there's also a need to update the industrial and occupational classification systems to better capture renewable energy-related employment categories, and therefore to make it easier to do the kinds of macroeconomic studies that we need. And let me get back to a point I mentioned at the beginning as my last item. I think there's a real need to harmonize to the extent possible the methodologies used in different studies, to be as clear and as transparent as possible about the assumptions that are being made, because doing so will enhance the comparability of the results of the different studies, and I think therefore help us gain an even better understanding of the renewable energy employment than we have today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Michael. And also thank you for pointing out that there will be some more intellectual food and not only food for your stomach during the lunch break, because a colleague and I will be trying to explain a bit more of the method that help us to arrive at these numbers. Now, we've seen where we come from a bit, and we see where we are today. And on this panel, I think we want to also get some information and some opinion to see where we can go from here. And for that, I have a very distinguished panel, which I would like to introduce very, very briefly. To my left side, there's Arturo Servos. And for those of you in the room who do not know Arturo's, he's the chair of REN21. What was new to me is that you actually are a runaway from conventional energy in your past, so to speak. So you have a conventional energy background, but you have more than 25 years experience in the renewable energy. And I just have 3 items on my list of your list of positions that you are holding, which is president of EREC, the chairman of the Global Wind Energy Council, and of the European Wind Energy Association. And with that, I stop and I welcome you here, Arturos. I do not need to introduce Hugo because he already introduced me, so I cannot return the favor. So I go to Marlene, who is a very dear, almost friend and colleague of mine, actually. And this is the face behind the numbers of German employment that you've been seen for the second time in the last 1.5 hours. So Marlene is actually the lead author of this study series on employment in Germany, on the ex-post analysis of employment. And you have been doing that for, oh my God, this is almost 10 years, isn't it? The first study was 2004. Marlene works for the German Aerospace Center in the System Analysis and Technology Assessment group, where we met, actually. Yeah, that's part of my past too. And I do not need to introduce Francesco because he already has been introduced and already gave the introduction to this session. So we can just switch pretty much to the topics and more details. We've seen, as I said, where we come from. We've seen a bit of where we stand today. So now, where are we going? We've heard this morning a statement from China and the Chinese capabilities and production capacities. And we've also, when you look more closely at the report that we are introducing here, there is some analysis of overcapacities, especially in PV. We might be heading for overcapacities also in the wind energy section. And I would like to first pass that question to Francesco, who comes from the private sector, and ask him, well, what do you think? What will be the, let's say, impact of overcapacities on future job creation and especially on the regional distribution of future job creation in the short to midterm? And if Arturo might prepare to give a stab at that question, that would be really helpful. So this question I would like to first, obviously everybody is free to add some comment to this, but these are the persons I have in focus for that question. Thank you.
Well, I think, overcapacity is something that this industry will always have on a cyclical basis, because there is always going to be an hysteresis in the decision-making process. And I think what we have already experienced in the PV industry, in the crystalline part of the PV industry, is clearly the fact that there was a big demand in Europe. The Chinese industry was quicker than anybody else to adapt to that big demand, and I think it was a good proof of capability to invest and react quickly to market changes. So all of a sudden, demand in Europe dropped and was not substituted by additional demand elsewhere, at least to the same degree of order of magnitude. So there was, for 3 years now, 2.5 or 3 years, some overcapacity. I would say nothing particularly tragic if you look at overcapacities, situations that other industries have experienced before. We're talking about the steel industry overcapacity, which took 20 years to be digested. And we're talking about the automotive industry overcapacity, which is not yet absorbed after years and years. I don't think this is something specially of the renewable energy industry. Actually, I think in the renewable energy industry, overcapacities will continue to manifest in different forms now and then. I think, by the way, in the area of wind industry, there has already been overcapacity in the last. I think I'm talking about 3-4 years ago. There was a clear indication of overcapacity signs. This was addressed. I think it's perhaps less of a problem today in the industry. It can become another time an overcapacity issue maybe in the next couple of years if demand doesn't really pick up elsewhere in the world outside of the US and Europe. But we have signs that this is happening in other parts of the world. So I think you have to take this as a physiological part of the industry. There has to be overcapacity for an industry to evolve. There's no way that an industry can evolve perfectly balanced all the time. This is something out of human comprehension. There has to be overcapacity and shortage by and large over time. I'm not particularly concerned about this. In fact, the only thing is try not to get caught into it on the wrong side of the value chain, but that's all.
Well, thanks for also pointing out that there is a demand side and a supply side to the overcapacity issue. And maybe Arturos wants to be stressing the demand side of it.
I just want to make 2 points following what Francesco said. That if we look at the job issue that we are discussing, I think that we have to take into account that when we're talking over capacity, that it's not only the manufacturing part, but the operational maintenance. So what we see at this point, which is an overcapacity, on the other hand, we see an expansion in different markets, which in terms of the jobs, if you make the total, you see an increase in jobs in reality due to the operational maintenance part, especially in the PV sector. So that's one point. The second point I would like to make is why we have the overcapacity. And I think the main reason, and I think we'll come back to the discussion afterwards on that, it's the instability of the policy frameworks, especially in Europe, that have created this story. So it's not an inherent, if you want, in the production, or it is the policy, that how the policy has influenced in reality the development, especially of PV in the last few years, and the change in policies in some important countries like Spain, which led to this to the situation we are today. But on the other hand, what we have seen these last few years is the drop in on the costs, which is a significant, I think, development, and which make us be very positive for the continuation in the future.
I know that the operation and maintenance issue has been stressed by Marlene in her report, so I do the ladies' first part, since we do have a lady on this panel. And then, Hugo, you can also add to that question.
Well, the operations and maintenance, I would actually address at another point again. I'm so far very pleased that it has been mentioned so often, because very often it just gets ignored. I have the feeling everybody talks about industrial jobs and not about installation, operation, and maintenance. But when it comes to overcapacities, for me, it's quite a difficult issue, because how long do we have overcapacities? I mean, PV, we had, I think, 60 gigawatt production capacity in 2012, which is around the same level probably. There's been quite some, job losses in Germany, but not really production capacities that have been turned off that dramatically. At the same time is the question, how does the market actually develop? In 2012, we had, I think, roughly, 31 gigawatt of PV installation globally. For 2013, now the rumors are between 35 and 37 gigawatt. If 2014, if you ask analysts, I mean, they kind of fight over it, but we have the range between 40 and 50 gigawatt. So no one really knows what's happening. And again, it's dependent on essentially two countries. And if the politicians, stand stable and follow what they have started, or if they do what has happened in Spain and kind of turn backwards. So it's essentially this time not Europe, but it is China and it is Japan that really are the ones that are crucial for how the next couple of years will evolve with photovoltaics. And really, when you look at that, I mean, 60 gigawatt production capacity, potentially 50 gigawatt installations. Very soon there might be another boom of new production capacities coming up in other parts of the world, maybe again in China, but there's also other possibilities. Who knows? This industry has been so difficult to really grab that I'm not the one who's going to do any predictions anymore.
Now you stopped doing that forecast? Hugo.
Thank you, Rika. In my professional career, I have learned that it's never too late to try to fix a mistake. And I want to do justice to you and to show you the evidence. You have 2 degrees. One in physics in Germany, one in economics in the US. And you have been working in the garage, and you are now working in the Institute of Economic for computing.
Thank you, Hugo. That's really sweet of you. You want to add on overcapacities?
Of course. About questions, where are we going? And I think before joining IRENA 4 years ago, I spent 7 years at this International Renewable Energy Agency. Maybe it's changed in this example now. But I remember that those days, of course, we were having Spain second in all the statistics, wind, solar, close to Germany. But our message was always to say this is not normal. Okay? Mr. Kanzler mentioned before that it is normal to find jobs in manufacturing now and moving from Germany to China. So I think the statistics that we present now in the report of where we are going in this allocation of manufacturing capacity in a new country, it also shows exactly what happens in any other sector. Big markets in India, China, US, of course, now they are leading those statistics. These are the trends, and we continue like in all other sectors. And again, I think also the comments from my colleagues on operational maintenance. Also seen from a perspective of a person who has worked in bilateral cooperation and now in multilateral cooperation, the perception that I have from my delegates is that it's too much thinking in jobs in manufacturing. Mm-hmm. And it's so difficult to deliver the message that the jobs are in operational maintenance. It's so difficult. I think we should continue delivering this message.
I think installation and maintenance has been stressed, which leads me a bit to the next question, but widens the view in a way. So when you look along the value chain, so why do you think if we actually assume more demand, a higher demand, and a future deployment, larger deployment in the future, then for different regions, do you have like intuition what can be the opportunities along the value chain in different regions in the world? And maybe, Michael, you want to join us with your expertise from the chapter you wrote on the job report. You want to start with this?
Well, if I can actually comment on something that's sort of that's relevant to the previous round, you know, I think it's important clearly to look at this sort of from the, you know, sort of stepping back from the global level. You know, what does it all amount to, right? But what does strike me is in all this uncertainty, you know, even as overall the renewable energy grows, is that from the perspective of those who are actually in the industry, whether they are in manufacturing or in installations, operations, maintenance, feedstock preparation, you know, for them, I think well, not certainty certainly, but a better degree of predictability is often essential because, well, it's their livelihoods, right? I just want to bring that aspect in because, I mean, to tell you the truth, in part, I'm saying this because I've also worked with the international trade unions, who, of course, are very, very concerned about that particular dimension. And so to the extent that government policy can provide the proper framework, of course, not just for the private sector, but I think also for those who are finding their livelihoods in this industry, in this growing industry, I think it will be really important. Just one additional thought, if I may. Perhaps part of the issue with overcapacities and such is, you know, what will happen in countries like China? You know, will they be successful in expanding their own domestic demand, particularly for solar PV, right? I mean, that's the idea right now. I think if that happens and if that's done in a planned way, to the extent possible, maybe we will see less in the way of convulsions than we have in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Which brings me back to the question of the value chain, actually, because there's, as we observe, there's countries who are currently developing a large domestic demand, but maybe don't have production. They might have operation and maintenance, but maybe still not have. So there's a lot of different, let's say, combinations of different segments of what at least we economists call the value chain. And maybe you go back. I see you nodding, so you can pick up on that question, Francesco.
You know, this operation and maintenance thing is really important because, you know, in this cycle that we're in, we have a bubble of huge, if you take any country that starts from scratch, renewable energy development, you could take this part of the world which is in the verge of doing it, or you could take South Africa, which just started a few years ago. Then you see that from a moment where there is nothing, you have a big bubble of jobs because the installation cycle is there. Then sooner or later this kind of tapers off because you cannot keep installing all the time. You know, there is a moment of growth. Then you have these assets that generate power and they stay there. And around them, there is operation and maintenance business. And out of that business, which stays for 20, 30, 40 years, it stays forever. It really creates a great industry in the space where the infrastructure sits. So it's really radicated there. And around that, you see entrepreneurs developing other things. So I think not all countries might decide or might be successful in creating a manufacturing industry out of their renewable energy growth. Maybe some countries just too small for that, or they don't have policies that do that. So they will import from abroad goods to a certain extent. But sooner or later, they will develop their own manufacturing for supporting operation and maintenance to a certain extent. And perhaps on the long term, that will become an industry on a standalone basis. So for us, it's a very important business, the operation and maintenance business, because it's a long-term investment in a country. And I think countries should focus on that perhaps with more attention than just looking a new factory for a new panel. By the way, technological evolution makes these factories obsolete in a very short time. So you should be aware that this requires R&D, it requires a lot of investment to keep it up and running all the time, which not everyone can afford.
Yeah. More comments on that, Touros?
Yeah, I would go also a bit further. I would say that most probably what we're going to see is the concentration of manufacturing.
Yeah.
Because that's the. But if we look at the conventional sector, for example, coal. How many are the manufacturers of coal equipment in the world, or nuclear? The question is operational maintenance. So there are the stations there that they're running, that they have people who are running the stations, and that's where really the question of the jobs comes. The manufacturing is only a small part, especially if we look the conventional sectors. It's a very small part where the manufacturing is done. So it is really the operational maintenance, and I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see concentration on manufacturing. I don't know which countries, but that's how it usually happens. I remember when the development of wind started in China, they were adding about 20 manufacturers per month. So we had arrived at the moment of we had 100 manufacturers in China of wind turbines. So we ended up with 3 or 4, as it happened also in Denmark in the late 80s. It was the same story. So the concentration, it is something that is going to happen. But on the other hand, you have the expansion of operational maintenance, and you have it everywhere there, and not only the countries where you have the manufacturing.
Marlene, you just want to add on that?
Yeah, I just want to give maybe a couple numbers for you to get an idea. I mean, Germany has had a development for quite some years now. And if you look at the operation and maintenance side, it's more than 20%. We had 380,000 jobs around that ballpark. And more than 20% of those were in operation and maintenance. And if you add the biofuel production and that all accounts to almost 40% of those jobs. So it's quite a large number. At the same time, there's also in the installation, planning, installation, all these things that have to be done at the scene, so to say, where the installation actually takes place. So it's a very regional issue. Depending on the technology you look at, you have between 15 up to more than half of the investment that goes into that area. So really, as was mentioned before, the PV modules that everybody talks about is only one part of the whole installation. There's also other areas like, for example, mounting structures, which is a very local thing. In Germany, there's lots and lots of mounting structure producers, and these things are a very regional thing because, I mean, look at the rooftops in different countries. They have totally different, circumstances, so you really need different structures there as well. So there is potential for a industry in every country, I believe. And also, everybody talks about wind and solar PV all the time. This is not because only because it is the largest part of growth that we've seen so far, but it's also because this is the area that everybody has information about. We know everything about wind, we know quite a lot about PV, and then it becomes very thin. And this is mainly, I believe, because wind and PV are really global markets. So it's easier to actually get the information. All these other sectors, there's so many, I mean, talk about heating and so on and so forth. It's just very local, and therefore there's not good information available. But these are really areas where lots of jobs can be created by every country, I believe.
I think it's like in the best families, you always talk about the children that trouble you most or that require the most attention. The silent child, there's heat pumps. Who's going to talk about that? Hugo, you want to add on that?
Because I think what I see when you travel and when you talk with the project developers, I think they know very well what they can localize and what they should import. That's the industry they know very well. you have a steel industry and nuclear powers. And I believe, and I feel, because the developers are trying to get everything locally. When they have a multi-megawatt PV farm in Peru, if it's an Spanish company, this person is going to look to try to find, as Manuel said, most of the things in the country. So yes, I think it's private sector, one that knows more and better how they can maximize the capital, which is in their own.
That was a very elegant way of circumventing the minefield of local content, wasn't it? Some of you have already mentioned that we could learn something from more mature industries, other sectors. Francesco, you mentioned the steel industry and automotive. And I use this as a small advertising break. We are the colleague, I'm doing the lunch, the colleagues actually, 2 colleagues are over there. We have been writing a report on the value chain of renewable energy for RTD IEA, and we also mentioned a lot of the impacts from the other sector. But here I am as the moderator, and this is the end of the advertising break. So what can we learn from looking at, for instance, you already pointed out the automotive, but when you look at the automotive, you also see there's massive governmental intervention in some, let's say, periods of neediness. Is that a call for government intervention, or what can we learn from the other sectors?
Well, I think that the less we have government interventions, the easier the predictability of the system becomes, because government interventions tend to be on one direction or the other quite dramatic. They either distort the market or immediately cut it with very little time to react. And I think the car industry had their own troubles in dealing with government interventions. So I don't think we should, possibly we should not try to follow the same curve. But I think another industry that has to do a lot with this solar PV is the semiconductor industry, for example, or the consumer electronics, TV screens and that stuff. So here the question is not government intervention to some extent, it's more about technological evolution and really new products that are better, cheaper, and perform different tasks that are all of a sudden available, and new markets that open. I think it's clear that, for example, when you look at what this generation of solar panels can do, it's being there now for 2-3 years, okay? It's not really improving anymore with the same degree of pace that we had the time ago. So maybe another year or 2, and then there is going to be a breakthrough, and a new generation of panels will make this whole thing obsolete all of a sudden. I mean, this can happen. I think it will actually happen, because there's so much money thrown into this R&D and so many bright people studying it that it will happen. So I think that's what maybe we should focus and try to understand in the value chain, and not try to really manage with the state intervention the variables, because they tend to be too many, and typically the state intervention is too late and with the wrong measure. It's either too much or too little, and it's never really perfect. I mean, it took Germany several years to finally find a way to manage this process when it was pretty late, okay? And any other countries that tried, Italy included, failed. I mean, none so far has found a way to manage decently the growth of, for example, solar PV. And those that did it, at the end, they decided not to have it, like French. They said, okay, we just stop it, and that's it. So I think that's a little bit rough. Maybe we should try to avoid too much of a state intervention in this industry. I think it has not been helpful, maybe at the very early phases. Today it's a bit dangerous, I think.
Maybe from those of you who have been to other sectors or worked in related sectors, or just from experience, what can we learn from, let's say, for instance, the semiconductor industry, or what can we learn from any other sector? Commenting on that? Arturo?
Yeah, I would take another point. I think that we have a lot of examples, and I think it's going to be an issue, especially in some parts of the world where we see this turmoil happening of going up and down, and which is the sustainable of the skilled workforce. So how do you sustain a skilled workforce? Mm-hmm. And in that sense, Francesco, I would say that you could see a government intervention in a different way, which are the capacity building programs, for example, which is a completely other issue. Yeah, which is a different issue, and there we could see a role because it is an important part, and also looking at the developing world where we expect to see a lot of developments happening, then you need the people to follow that and to stay in the job. So I think these two elements, the sustainability of the skilled workforce on the one hand, and on the other, the capacity building programs are very important. And in that sense, IRENA's also renewable learning platform, I think it's a very good tool in that direction. Okay.
I'm receiving small signals that we should come to a concluding round on this panel. And since we already are at the issue of governmental and politics, and somehow we don't live in a policy-free environment, and sometimes we thank for it, and sometimes we grudge with it. So, what do you think as a, let's say, final statement? You may also include whatever I didn't ask you and you wanted to bring to this panel, but I ask you to focus, and I just do a quick round, starting maybe with you, Michael, again, to go that way again. So what are the, necessary, or what's the most necessary condition on future policies to, let's say, maximize or to get the most of socioeconomic benefits out of a renewable energy deployment? And as an indicator for socioeconomic benefits, we usually take jobs, which brings us back to the topic there.
Well, it seems to me, actually what I wanted to do, and I think it probably is in line with what you were asking, is I did want to respond a bit to this notion that, maybe there's a danger of too much government involvement. I speak only in a personal capacity, let me stress this. I really see it almost more the other way around. Clearly, there is a problem with government policies that go off the tracks. But if we look at the broader picture, right, the need that we have as a global civilization at this point in time is to advance the expansion of renewable energy, of clean energy, as much as fast as we can, relative to the challenge of climate change, which really looms incredibly large before us. So it seems to me, in a situation that is anything but normal, is there not a need for governments to say we have to really step up far more than we have today? Yes, we have to do this in an intelligent way. We have to do this in a way that works for the private sector. We have to do this in a way that allows people to acquire skills, to maintain a sense of, a steadiness of livelihoods, of incomes, and so on. But it seems to me there's really a need for due haste, if I can call it that. And that, it seems to me, requires that we take the lessons learned, the best practices that we do see around the world, and try to replicate them as much as possible in other parts of the world. Now, clearly, saying that, I do realize that every region, every country has its own conditions, its own opportunities and challenges. So clearly, there is no one blueprint that can just easily be applied. But I think we need more than the normal workings of the market in order to get to where we need to be. And let me just say one more thing, if I can. It seems to me as well that we should really think very much not just about the numbers of jobs, as important as these are, but also the quality of these jobs. And I think we need to do a far better job of understanding. I think one of the reasons why countries are so interested in creating jobs in the manufacturing aspect of renewable energy is that often these are higher skilled jobs. They are the kinds of jobs that allow a broader range of activities, related activities, supply chains, and so on to spring up. And so I think that importance shouldn't be lost. That distinction shouldn't be lost, I think, in the discussion.
I would like to go around like that, but end with Hugo, because I think then he can take over with the organizational stuff and make announcement for coffee break and such, right? So you just skip Hugo, but continue with Arturos.
For me, I think for the future and for what we need, I think I said it at the beginning, I will repeat it, and I think it's the most important element for me. It's a stable and predictable policy framework that we have to work on. And in that sense, I will go to your direction in terms, because to have a stable and predictable policy framework, we need to have a policy from the government which is that is running and which is optimistic. But it has to, and my feeling also, giving the example of Europe, I think the question of the targets is a very important issue. So it's a policy framework, you put some targets, and then depending on the country, then you find the instruments to reach them. But I think this is an issue, and unfortunately, I think that we see some changes in the European scene, which I'm not very optimistic what we're going to see, especially tomorrow, where the Commission comes out with their recommendations. Mm-hmm. But that has been the big success story of Europe, and of Germany in particular, where we have seen the most stable, let's say, framework in the last decade, and where we have seen also most of the jobs to be created in the sector.
Marlene, Germany has been mentioned.
Germany has been mentioned. Yeah, it's. I think I have many opinions and thoughts, but I'd like to go back to something we asked the German renewable energy industry in 2005. Actually, it was the first study that we did. We asked them what was the most important factors that made Germany such an attractive location for them to produce and do their business. And really, the factor number one was not the market itself, but it was the human resources, the qualified human resources. So this is really a very important point, because you can have as many goals as you want to. If you don't have people who can actually do it and deliver, well, you will never achieve any of them. At the same time, going a little bit stressing the comment that Arturos gave is if there is a policy and politicians decide to influence the market, then it should be long term. We have our heating sector definitely has had troubles, and there's quite some companies who try to completely ignore what's going on with politics in order to have a stable development. And if you ask for a sustainable development of an industry, that's definitely the point. So long-time stable market is very crucial.
Well, I think that jobs are created every time money is invested. And in order for a place or a market to attract investment money, certain trust should be there in a place. Trust is destroyed every time you have retroactive changes. Trust is destroyed every time you have changes in taxation after the investment is done. These are things that are killers for further growth. And I think on top of that, once you avoid these kind of mistakes, there should be freedom to move money, so extract capital that you have invested and bring back dividends. And not many places in the world have this. I mean, there are some places that would be great for renewable growth, but don't meet this kind of criteria, so no one is investing there. And on top of that, I think if you have a regulatory framework that gives basic visibility to long-term pricing of the energy, it is a clear yes. Lacking that, it's very difficult to invest. And on top of it, I think there should be rules that establish how the regulatory framework will evolve. It's impossible to have a regulatory framework set forever. It has to change because technology changes, and it's right to change the regulatory frameworks. But we should know how, what kind of rules are there to allow this. Many countries have done a very good job at doing this. I'm talking about South America. I mean, Brazil had a very good example. Uruguay is doing a very good job. But that, once these things are there, then investment comes and jobs are created. Maybe not manufacturing jobs, but certainly operation and maintenance jobs, for sure. And development jobs and construction jobs, everything. But without the trust of the investors, without a country being able to give some comfort that money can be invested without major risks, I think it's very difficult to create jobs in any industry, including renewables, clearly.
In any industry, yeah, you're right. Well, I thank everybody. I learned a lot. And before handing over to Hugo for a final word and some organizational remarks, I just want you all to thank our panelists and thank you.
We should not only look to promote renewable energy because of employment. And as I said, I spent 7 years spreading the word with Spanish experience. And it's clear that we did not start because of new jobs, but the energy dependency. And so energy security, environmental aspect of those in the economy. But we also have said here that for this is necessary an enable environment. This has to come from the government. We have to have transmission lines. We have to have anticipation policies, research policies. And the third comment is what we have already mentioned that maybe countries should not only focus in manufacturing, but also the importance to operational maintenance. So thank you very much to all. Thank you to you again, Ulrike, for stepping in and saving us in this unfortunate event and stepping in. And yes, I will only say that we will go now for a coffee break in this room, and I would like to resume the session in 5 past.